Hello and welcome to this channel if you're new here, and welcome back to regular viewers. If you love British history, then you are definitely in the right place. Here you can find videos about all aspects of British history, short and long form documentaries, virtual tours of historic locations and interviews with eminent historians. It is also the home of the Thursday Tea Time History Chat Live, streamed live each Thursday at 1 p.m. London time, where you can join me, Philippa, to talk through history topics relevant to the week. In this episode, I am delighted to bring to you my chat with historian Tracy Borman about female rule in Britain. Tracy is a best-selling author, historian and broadcaster specialising in the Tudor period. Her books include Elizabeth's Women, Thomas Cromwell, The Private Lives of the Tudors, Henry VIII and the Men Who Made Him, and most recently, Crown and Sceptre, a history of the British monarchy. She has also written a fictional trilogy, The King's Witch, based in the court of James I. Listen out for details of how you can win this signed copy of Tracy's book, The Private Lives of the Tudors, at the end of this video. Tracy is also Joint Chief Curator of Historic Royal Palaces and Chief Executive of the Heritage Education Trust. She has presented a number of history programmes for Channel 5 and the Smithsonian Channel, including The Fall of Anne Boleyn, Inside the Tower of London, and Henry VIII and the King's Men. She is a regular contributor to BBC History magazine and gives talks on her books across the country and abroad. And indeed, I was fortunate enough to hear Tracy speak at the Church of St John the Baptist in Cirencester recently. I'm also very happy to say that Tracy will be speaking on all of the history tours I'm organising in 2022 this year. They are fully booked now, but make sure you don't miss out in 2023 by signing up to receive my newsletter at britishhistorytours.com. Now today we are focusing our discussion on Tracy's latest book, Crown and Sceptre. Now, members of my British History Patreon were able to ask Tracy their own questions, which I put to her after the main interview. You can become a patron and see the video at patreon.com/British History, as well as gaining loads of history lover benefits, including putting your own questions to future guests. Take a look at the memberships available. Now, let's get into today's episode. I want to welcome Tracy and say a big thank you to you for speaking to me today. Your latest book is fantastic, and although you begin in 1066, you set the scene for the Norman invasion and what follows in the period before, and which, as I listened, it became more and more clear that knowing what was in place prior to William of Normandy landing it becomes more vital in understanding not only what happened immediately following the conquest, but those ripple effects on the monarchy ever since. And there is so much I could and would love to delve into with you from your book. But today we're going to focus on female rule in England and consequently Britain. I'd like to begin with, if I may, the underlying assumptions of female rule being somewhat of an abomination and to be avoided at all costs. So why was the idea of female rule so strongly rejected in the past?
That's a really great question. I mean, partly it was that, or mostly, I guess, it was just the role of women in society, their position in society. They were seen as second-class citizens, really. Widely held belief was that women were weaker physically, mentally, emotionally, and that it was a deeply limited and conventional view that, women were there to basically keep the species going, but men were there as leaders. And now I've simplified it a lot because, of course, you do get exceptions to that with some strong female regents that actually did manage to kind of hold on to their position. But here in Britain, and really more precisely England in the period I'm talking about, we didn't have a great track record of female rulers. We didn't have many of them, frankly, until the Tudors. We had the Empress Matilda, who plunged the country into civil war because she went about her rule completely the wrong way. She was very high-handed and arrogant. She didn't appreciate the need to win hearts and minds. She just wanted to win arguments, really. And it plunged the country into civil war. But she did have a really tall order to actually come in as queen and get people to accept her because of that, deep-seated misogyny that existed in society. And it's something that runs all the way through history. We still haven't quite got over it today, I think it's fair to say, but we're much further advanced. But that only really changes with Elizabeth. And I think it's Elizabeth who, in the sort of second half of the 16th century, actually persuades people that queens can work. Queens are quite a good idea. She was such a positive role model as a female sovereign. But until then, there really weren't many or any positive kind of role models for that. So after Empress Matilda, then, you've got a big gap. Mary Tudor, just before her, of course, Lady Jane Grey. Perhaps unfair to judge her as a failure because she didn't want to be queen, and then she was put on the throne and quickly taken off it. So she didn't have a chance to prove herself. But as I say, it all changed with Elizabeth, but it just took a very long time to overcome those deep-seated prejudices.
So we'll talk more in depth about the Queen's regnant. Have I got that the right way around?
Yes.
It shortly. I'm also interested, though, to just talk briefly, and probably a bit high level, but about there was a way for women to be influential via being the Queen consort. What level of influence did they have, and do we have any good examples of ones that were liked or disliked, and how influential were they? And
you're absolutely right in that's how women could really gain power, and they did gain power. And I hate it when it's called soft power, because it somehow demeans it. But Queen's consort, there are so many examples of very, very clever, able Queen's consort who knew how to work within the boundaries that were set. And I'm thinking of the likes of Eleanor, both Eleanors actually, Eleanor of Castile, consort of Edward I, also more famously Eleanor of Aquitaine, the consort of Henry II, who really absolutely did wield power and not all that subtly. And my own personal favourite
there, was she?
Exactly, not soft at all. My own personal favourite is Matilda of Flanders, the wife of William the Conqueror, who just brought much needed kind of profile, positive profile to the royal family. She appreciated that there was a lot of PR involved in being a successful dynasty, and that's something her husband William the Conqueror did not appreciate. He just tried to beat people into submission, whereas Matilda went about it much more cleverly, trying to win hearts and minds. So there are some fantastic examples, particularly in the medieval period, of Queen's consort. And so that was really where the greatest power lay throughout history for women, because we've still had far, far more kings than queens. So, I can talk in a quite sweeping way about this, that, it was Queen's consort. That was the real opportunity to kind of exert power and influence.
Mm. So then we get to the Tudor period. We come on to this quite quickly because the only contenders for the throne are female. So it's time for a bit of a rethink in society, I should have thought. And when it becomes clear, so in 1553, that Edward VI is not going to live, and he's only got female relatives in which to choose from for his successor, his two half-sisters, obviously Mary and Elizabeth, and his Grey cousins. And he chooses Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, over his half-sisters. Why did he choose to do that?
Yeah, well, a lot was to do with Edward being manipulated, I think, by those around him, in particular, Lady Jane Grey's sort of father-in-law, John Dudley. But also Edward wanted to be sure that the next ruler would be uncontestably Protestant. It was that his driving force was his Protestant religion. And even though his sister Elizabeth was Protestant, he didn't want to take the risk that she would marry some foreign Catholic prince. And so he disinherited her along with Mary, who was very much a Catholic, openly so. Whereas Lady Jane Grey, she was destined to marry Guildford Dudley, the son of John Dudley. She was a much safer bet as a Protestant monarch, and so that's why he disinherited. And of course, with quite tumultuous results after that.
Because I was going to say, Lady Jane's crown, it was very quickly disputed by Mary, of course, but it became obvious very quickly that Mary had got a lot of support. And where did that level of support come from? Do you think it was always rumbling there? Did people just expect that it was going to be Mary? Where did that come from?
I'm so sorry about my dog Cromwell barking in the background.
Cromwell. I love
if we wait until he's quiet, we won't be recording this at all. It just takes anybody walking past. There was a huge groundswell of support for Mary among Protestants and Catholics alike. And that's because she was seen as a princess of the blood. She was the true successor. Regardless of your religion, it was birth that mattered. And she was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII. She was next in line. People didn't like the laws being overturned like that, the succession in particular being overturned. So she appealed to that. She is the true Tudor princess, and Lady Jane Grey is just an interloper. And that's how I think she kind of won that particular battle for support across the country.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk here a little bit about Mary, actually, because she gets the reputation with this nickname of Bloody Mary. But what kind of ruler actually was she, and did she deserve that nickname?
I don't think she does deserve all the bad press. Certainly she doesn't deserve to be dismissed as just Bloody Mary and that unmitigated disaster of a rule. She had a lot to overcome, and she had to set a lot of precedents as a queen regnant, because there hadn't been one for 350 years. And those precedents benefited her sister Elizabeth, who is often, and I've done it myself, compared very favourably to Mary, because she was, undoubtedly the more successful and certainly the longer reigning queen. But she did owe Mary a lot for that, even down to, Mary's coronation, how she should be styled, and her relationship with regard to Philip, her husband. So I do think Mary had an awful lot to overcome, and she had that kind of endemic prejudice to overcome. But where I think Mary did fall down is not being pragmatic enough. She was dogmatic. She stuck to her principles come hell or high water. And of course, her most famous of principles was that her desire to restore Roman Catholicism. And I think what she didn't appreciate was that need for compromise, that need for toleration. And it really proved her undoing as queen. She even some Catholics, quite a few Catholics actually, were appalled by the burning of Protestants. And it really did lose Mary that sort of goodwill of her people. And if you do that, then you've got a very hard job to stay queen. Of course, she didn't lose her throne. She died quite young, and just after 5 years, we'd consider it young today. After 5 years as being queen. But, one wonders what would have happened if she'd stayed queen much longer, because there was this real groundswell of opposition rising up, I think, against her. And also the fact that she married the King of Spain, and Englishmen didn't like the idea that England was just going to be a little satellite of Spain and kind of swallowed up by this great empire. So I think she perhaps could have chosen more wisely, as, in a husband anyway.
I find it interesting how attitudes towards female rule had to change with Mary because she got married. And when there changes brought in order to protect England from becoming a satellite of Spain, I believe there were some rules around the marriage.
There were indeed quite stringent rules, actually, to protect that from, to prevent that from happening. So I just lost what word I wanted then. Absolutely. And also to really project the fact that Mary was sovereign. Philip was her consort. He wasn't going to be King of England in his own right. And that's something Mary actually wanted. She wanted him to have power. But there were rules put in place so that she was sole queen. So she was, that was an important distinction. It's not a joint monarchy. in the true sense of the word. For example, when much later in the late 17th century, we get William III and Mary as proper joint monarchs, it wasn't like that. And Parliament wanted to make absolutely sure that England wasn't just going to be some little offshoot of the much greater Spanish Empire. So they did put some very, very stringent rules in place to protect against that.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because once rules are in place, they're more difficult to remove. So
absolutely.
So we get then another female to female change of power. This time, though, slightly more peaceful, because we go from Mary to her half sister Elizabeth, which is interesting. Thinking of how keen, that's not even a strong enough word, Mary was to bring the country back under the Catholic faith and the Pope, but she left her throne to her half sister, her Protestant half sister Elizabeth. How close to her death did Mary name Elizabeth her successor, and did she actually have any other choices?
I don't think she had too many other choices, so I'll start with that one. There were other blood claimants, but given what had happened with Mary's accession, I think she knew people wouldn't accept another kind of Lady Jane Grey, for example. But Mary did resist until almost her kind of final hour from naming Elizabeth as her successor, because religion was all consuming for Mary. And she tried desperately to make Elizabeth promise to uphold the Catholic religion. And Elizabeth was quite discreet in her answers, but I think Mary knew full well that the first thing Elizabeth would do would be to overhaul this kind of counter-reformation that Mary had set in train. So really, I think Mary knew in her heart for a long time that it was going to have to be Elizabeth. Certainly when those pregnancies turned out to be either phantom pregnancies or the result of actually some kind of cancer. But she just didn't want to name her. She was almost, to her last breath, just clinging on to hope of a different successor somehow. And I think Elizabeth learned from that as well, because she knew how people, the minute that it became obvious Mary wasn't going to have any children, how people started flocking to her. And she didn't want the same to happen to her when she was queen. So she held off naming James VI of Scotland as her heir for the same reason. She didn't want to lose the attention and the love of her people. So again, Elizabeth benefited, really. She'd learned a valuable lesson from her sister.
It's interesting how Elizabeth trod very carefully, even with her sister on her deathbed.
Yes.
There's some, I don't know, what would you call it there? Some sort of sisterly love, or was she being political? Or was she, is there any point in telling someone on their deathbed you are not going to see through their wishes?
I think Elizabeth is a great pragmatist. I think she's one of the best examples of a pragmatist in history. So why upset the apple cart? She's going to be discreet. I don't think it's necessarily sisterly love. I think she's just being quite political. She doesn't like to play her cards too openly. She, for the same reason, doesn't mention her mother very much, even though I think she absolutely revered Anne Boleyn's memory. But she knew that such things could be divisive. So she kept her counsel, and I think she was very sensible in doing that.
Yeah, and actually quite a good indication, or that was the beginnings of how she trod that very fine line for as long as she could, I think.
Yes, she did. Religion. Absolutely.
So she is probably our most famous female monarch, I'd have thought, and not least because I think, in my opinion, because of her epithets of Gloriana and the Virgin Queen. What was she like? Does she deserve those? How good a ruler was she? And I really want to know, when do you think Elizabeth decided not to get married?
Oh, I think I'm going to answer that first so I don't forget it, because I think she decided from the age of 8. She vowed when she was 8 years old that she would never marry. And what happened when she was 8 is the execution of Catherine Howard, a stepmother of Elizabeth's. She'd had a few of those. And of course, she was also very much aware of what happened to her own mother, Anne Boleyn. As to whether she deserves, the Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the iconic reputation, I would say absolutely she does. She was my favourite monarch before writing Crown and Sceptre, and she's even more my favourite now. Having researched 40 other monarchs, I had something to compare her with, and I just think she's so admirable. She made such sacrifices in order to do what was right. She was, as I said, I always admire pragmatism in people. I think it's a great skill to have, and she managed to find a middle way in religion. She didn't rush into wars, and she realized that it was very, very important to keep listening to her people. She set their will, above most other things, and they adored her for it. Well, I was in a recent kind of debate about we kind of ran a World Cup of monarchs, and Athelstan beat Elizabeth to the title of our greatest British monarch, which I'm still outraged by. Because nobody's even heard of him for a start, and it's got to be Elizabeth. She had so much to overcome as well. That very strong prejudice against female rulers was still there. Her half-sister's reign had been pretty disastrous, and yet she triumphed. She confounded expectations, and she went down in history. But I do think she deserves that. It's not just spin. It's not just PR. She had the goods to back it up.
So do you think she was as successful in changing then minds about female monarchy in her own time? Hello, Kate.
Sorry,
in her own time.
I think she was actually. I think she was, because I think what was her masterstroke is that she pretended to agree with all of these male courtiers who thought it was a disaster. And now I've got the dog barking, I've got the cat on my desk. I'm very sorry, it's like a menagerie here. So she pretended that, and that got them on side. Because, she was famously apologetic for being a weak and feeble woman. I don't think she believed that for a minute.
I don't know.
It's easy to get somebody on side if you kind of flatter their opinions and pretend that you agree. That's a much more effective tactic. And then when you look at her actions, it's clear she didn't believe a word of that. She absolutely believed in her own power, but she did win people over. And by the end, she was widely mourned, and at all levels of society. It wasn't, there might have been a kind of slight sense of relief when James ascended the throne, because we've got a man at last, but they were soon regretting the loss of good Queen Bess, and kind of bring back the Tudors, all is forgiven.
I love that she said things like, I'm a weak and feeble woman, and then there's just a big but after.
Yes, yes,
but I'm about to do this.
Despite that, yes.
Fantastic. She just had such an ear and eye for not just the theatre of court, but how her actions came across, winning people over, I suppose. It's really interesting to think of her learning that from her life experiences, I suppose. There's no coaches in Tudor England, I assume, as to how to control your PR.
She watched and she learned. She was never supposed to be queen. And a running theme throughout my book is some of our most successful monarchs were not supposed to come to the throne. And I don't know why that is. If there's not that kind of sense of entitlement, it's because they have to kind of work harder for it. If it wasn't theirs by birthright. But Elizabeth was an absolute classic example of this. She was almost the forgotten younger daughter of Henry VIII, never going to be queen, and she made a better job of it than any of the other of Henry's heirs.
Her story is fantastic, and I believe Queen Anne, when she came to the throne, sort of re-invoked the memory of Elizabeth.
Yes, she did, because Anne gets a bad press as well, in a way, or at least she gets the press of just being pregnant 17 times. That's what people dismiss her. That's it, basically. Anne was very charismatic. She absolutely was in tune with the people, and she brought back much beloved royal ceremonies, such as touching for the king's evil. Now, the king's evil was the disease scrofula, and there was this big ceremony that had been around for centuries, where the monarch would sort of sit enthroned, and then a procession of their subjects who were suffering from the disease would come and be touched by the king or queen. And people set a lot of store by this ceremony, and Queen Anne realised that. And she reinstated it. And there's a lovely description of Samuel Johnson actually receiving the royal touch and just what it meant to him as well. People didn't forget things like that. And so I think Anne absolutely was a chip off the old Elizabeth block in terms of being in touch with the wishes of your people.
Anne fascinates me, actually. She was so hands-on as well. It was almost like because they didn't have a very great education, did they, Anne and her sister Mary? But she seemed to come to the throne with a great awareness of that and then put the work in. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's very fair. And I think that's very fair. She didn't come knowing everything, but she came willing to work. And she, I think, attended more council meetings than any other monarch before her. She was very assiduous in her duties. And yeah, she took it all very seriously. She didn't just like the froth and saccharine, it's been called, the pomp and the pageantry. She was actually prepared to work hard and fulfill what was then a constitutional role, because by the time of Anne, monarchy and the nature of monarchy had changed hugely. Monarchs no longer ruled, they merely reigned. It was a largely symbolic role. I mean, they still had a political role, but it was much less than it had been. And Anne appreciated that, and she really did take her duties very, very seriously. So I think she's hugely to be admired. And I'm pleased she's had a bit more focus in recent years, although I'm not sure the film, The Favourite, makes us remember her for what we should.
No, I've spoken about that more recently, about that film. It's one of my least favourites for being called the favourite.
I know.
So her sister Mary II had already been queen, like you mentioned earlier, as a joint monarch with William III, her husband. Now she predeceased him, so we get the joint monarchy, then William, and then Anne. But Mary didn't seem that interested in being a queen. Is that fair?
She wasn't. That's totally fair. She really didn't. She did this very reluctantly. She could just about cope with being a joint monarch with her husband. But when William was away, as he often was, campaigning on behalf of his native Netherlands, Mary hated taking the mantle of power. It was completely contrary to her nature, to her outlook. And she would write these letters to William, basically begging him to come back because she didn't want to be sole queen, even though actually I think she did a better job of it than she thought. But I think what Mary was very conscious of is that people disapproved of the fact that she'd basically turned against her father, James II. She'd come in, she'd taken his throne with this foreign interloper, William of Orange. And I think she was very, very conscious of that. So she was always kind of professing her modesty and how she really didn't feel up to the job. Because I think she was very conscious of the hostility, actually, particularly amongst the Jacobites, those who still wanted the Stuarts, the old Stuarts back on the throne.
I mean, there's a podcast episode all of its own, isn't it? The Jacobites.
Yes.
I just find it so incredible. We had another line of monarchy, really. Exiled, still living.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. All the way up to the kind of 18th century, I think they kind of lasted, and the Jacobite movement got weaker and weaker. And was a bit half-hearted, to say the least, towards the end. But there was this line, this true royal line, as you say, living in exile on the continent, and a sizable number of people wanted to see them back. Especially the Hanoverians, when they came in after Queen Anne's death without a direct heir, they really had to face the brunt of, or bear the brunt of, the Jacobite hostility, because the Hanoverians were seen as even further removed from the true line. They're just the electors of Germany. Let's bring back the rightful heirs, the Stuarts, and that was a feeling that was quite slow to die, I think.
I can see why. I mean, it was like I say, that's a whole episode in itself. But they did.
We should do a whole episode on that one.
They did end up with a very nice final resting place for Catholics, didn't they?
Yes. Yeah, not bad. Not bad. It could have been worse.
St. Peter's, aren't they, in the Vatican? How fabulous. So we'll definitely do one on that.
I know there's so many tangents you could go down with this, isn't there?
Absolutely. So we will come on to our own queen in a short while to finish off, because we're rapidly approaching her platinum jubilee. But of course, we've had Queen Victoria, who was, by the time of her death, our longest reigning monarch, now surpassed by our own. What kind of monarch do you think Victoria was? How would you summarize her rule, if that's possible?
Yeah, I think the Victorian age was great. If I'm honest, I don't think Victoria herself deserves to be called great. I think it's a case of missed opportunities with Victoria. So she was famous for being devoted to her husband, Albert, and for mourning him deeply when he died, when he was just in his early 40s, which was obviously a great tragedy for Victoria, but it dominated her life. Her relationship with Albert, both before and after death, dominated her life, and not in a positive way for her queenship. When he was alive, he was the dominant force. She took a back seat. She let him run the show. And then when he was dead, she basically retired from her public royal duties for over a decade, to the point where her government were begging her to come back because they feared a Republican movement was gathering ground. And then when she came back, she was a better queen than when Albert had been around, because she finally was able to give voice to her own opinions, and they were good opinions too. And I just think it's almost a shame that she hadn't been able to fulfill that potential earlier. And the last kind of 2 or 3 decades of her reign were the best. They were the most glorious, because she really became this figurehead for a self-confident age. It was the age in which we had an empire on which the sun never set, and it was an age of industry and engineering feats, and we led the world. And Victoria really came to epitomize that, and she took an active role in government. But I think we can't get over the fact that for the first kind of 2/3 of her reign, she didn't do any of that, or the first kind of half of her reign, she didn't do that. And also contrast her with our current queen, who lost her long-serving consort and husband, Philip, and was back at work 4 days later. And Victoria took more than a decade off after Albert's death. So I find that hard to overcome, really, as when you judge her as a monarch. Not as a woman, not as a wife, but as a monarch. I think she's seen as one of our greatest, but I'm not always that convinced that she was.
Taking a decade off it's quite, when you're the only one who can do your job. Probably pushing it a little bit.
I think so.
She did well to come back. And
yes, she did. She did. Definitely. She was lucky, really.
So let's come on to our own queen and the monarchy, because I'm interested in your opinions on this. So she's coming up to her the 70th. It's amazing. It's ruling for 70 years. Now, in that time, of course, just for the length of it, there's been immense social change. But also in how we regard the monarchy, I think, and how what we expect, how they function, what they do. The next 3 heirs, we're going to go back to the next 3 in line to the throne. We're going back to a male monarch for the foreseeable future. How do you think history will look back at Elizabeth II's rule, and how much of an influence she had personally on the way the monarchy has changed over her time as queen?
I think that the key word here to sum up Elizabeth II's contribution, her reign, her style, is duty. I think she's probably the most dutiful sovereign we've ever had. And that's something she learned from her father, George VI, who, of course, didn't want to be king. It was only thanks to his brother's abdication that he became king and then passed the throne to his daughter. She has been dutiful. She's been consistent, and she's provided continuity. I mean, those 70 years almost have seen unbelievable, unprecedented change worldwide. But she's been this, it's described as a kind of golden thread that runs through generations. And most people in this country have never known a time when she wasn't queen, which is quite extraordinary. As you say, 70 years, it's quite hard to get your head around. So her longevity, her duty, her consistency as well. But that all sounds a bit unglamorous. And I would like to just say as well how much she has changed the monarchy quietly, subtly, but things like streamlining the royal family so that it's less dependent on the public purse. But also, as you mentioned, she has now overturned centuries of male prejudice by giving equal precedence to women in the order of succession. So even though we do have, 3 male heirs ahead, in the future, the throne, if it's still going, will pass equally to women as to men, just the firstborn, whatever their sex. And I think that is a staggering achievement. That is it. And people don't talk about it or acknowledge it enough, I don't think. So I think that goes down as probably her greatest legacy, I think.
Yeah. Maybe we would have talked about it more had there been a female firstborn within the next 3 generations.
I know, that's the thing. We're stuck with men for a while.
We are. So I want to talk about this really. What is the future of the British monarchy? So we've got Charles and William, all as adult male. Obviously George is a little bit too small yet, but they're already seeming more willing, from my perspective anyway, to get involved with the issues of the day. And some would argue they are beginning to enter with some of these into the political arena, which we know the Queen was very much, she doesn't, or at least not publicly. Will we see the royal family becoming more publicly involved in the running of the country, using their influence, or do you think they will continue to be ceremonial?
I think the ceremonial aspect will continue because I think it's very important to uphold that tradition, that thread. But I think you're right in that both Prince Charles and Prince William are not afraid to get political. But I think where they can play a really valuable role is in advocating good causes, and the environment springs to mind. It's something that Prince Charles has spoken about for many, many years, and now I feel we're kind of finally listening to him a bit, and also his son William. But I think looking to the future, one of the most important roles that the monarchy can fulfill is one that really got going in the 18th century, and that's philanthropy, charity. Now, the Queen is patron of over 600 charities, and we know from those charities and the directors of them the difference it makes. If you have a royal patron, your income increases tenfold. And I think that's a really valid role. And people who are anti-monarchy, I think they dismiss it too easily. I think they have a huge role to play in that, both the championing of good causes, but also the charitable role as well. So I hope that alongside, the ongoing ceremony, which we all love, the pomp and the pageantry, there will be that really meaningful contribution to society.
Brilliant. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We're going to finish the main part of the episode now because I have some questions that my patrons have put forward. So we'll move on to those now. But thank you for answering those questions about
my pleasure
about female monarchy. Thank you. Now, I promised you a competition to win this signed copy of Tracy's book, The Private Lives of the Tudors. Now, if you would like to win this signed copy of this book, then you need to like this video, subscribe to the British History channel, and answer the following question in the comments. Much to Tracy's chagrin, who beat Elizabeth I to be considered our greatest monarch in a recent discussion she was involved in? So, much to Tracy's chagrin, who beat Elizabeth I to be considered our greatest monarch in a recent discussion she was involved in? Entries close on the 28th of February 2022. You can still comment, but please be aware that your answer will not count as an entry. The winner will be drawn on Wednesday the 2nd of March and announced on the live stream Thursday Tea Time History Chat Live on the British History YouTube channel on the 3rd of March. Thank you for watching this video. I'd love to know what you thought about the topics discussed today. Please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed it, please do give it the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you get notifications when a new video is uploaded. Remember, if you would like to win a signed copy of Tracy Borman's book, The Private Lives of the Tudors, you need to like this video, subscribe to the channel and answer the following question in the comments. Much to Tracy's chagrin, who beat Elizabeth I to be considered our greatest monarch in a recent discussion she was involved in? You will find the answer in the video. Entries close on the 28th of February 2022. You can still comment after this time, but please be aware that your answer will not count as an entry. The winner will be drawn on Wednesday the 2nd of March and announced on the live stream Thursday Tea Time History Chat Live on the British History YouTube channel on the 3rd of March. Don't worry if you can't catch it live, you will find it on the YouTube channel on playback. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.